In this video, I'd like to suggest some connections between the situation in a place like the city of Rome in the mid-1st century and the gospel themes in the Gospel of Mark. So on the right, I'll list some themes as we talk about some of the situations going on in Rome and elsewhere in the empire that might have influenced what Mark chose to emphasize. Well, there's the basic fact that by the 60s and 70s, the eyewitnesses who had lived with Jesus and walked with him were beginning to die. And so the question of preserving their testimony, preserving their eyewitness accounts, probably impelled the beginnings of the written forms of the Gospels. Now, as we'll see in our next week, we'll be reading about earlier written sources like the sayings of Jesus that might have predated these Gospels. But the impetus to write the story of Jesus' life, not just what he taught, but what happened, this seems to get an impetus in the late 1st century as perhaps the eyewitnesses are beginning to die. Now, keeping in mind what we saw in the last video, the turmoil that was going on in the mid-1st century in the Roman world, and particularly in the city of Rome, a lot of things were happening that we talked about in that last video. We had Nero's persecution of the Christians as he blamed them for the fire. We have the Jewish revolt trying to take advantage of Nero's weakness to rise up against Rome. But of course, the revolt was crushed and Jerusalem was destroyed along with its temple. Rome's victory was widely regarded as a signal of cosmic support, that the gods were on their side and not that of their enemies, like the Jews, or we can add the Christians. But at the same time, even though it seemed that peace had come and that there was now stability, life was still marked by sickness everywhere and by the oppression of Rome in places like Judea and the other provinces of the Roman Empire. So what themes do we see in this gospel? There's a huge emphasis on Jesus' suffering, and of course all the gospels will tell that story. But Mark's gospel is going to emphasize even more acutely that Jesus is a Messiah, but a suffering Messiah. As we'll see in another video, there's a great deal of emphasis on the passion and the suffering of Jesus in this particular gospel. And might this be because of the disruptions of the mid-1st century? Also, there is this effort to situate the opposition to Jesus in the work of Satan. You'll notice that the first one to test Jesus in this gospel is Satan in the wilderness. And when the religious leaders are introduced to us as plotting Jesus' murder, whether it's the Pharisees and Herodians in early chapter 3, or it's the chief priests and scribes when we get to Jerusalem, in some ways we are to see these as mere proxies for the one who ultimately is testing Jesus, Ho-Satan, that is the adversary, right? The one who drags you into court. That's a Persian loanword for the person who sues you and drags you to court. This is, though, a cosmic figure by this point in apocalyptic literature and so in Mark's gospel. And so what Mark is saying by situating Jesus' first real scene after his baptism as the scene in the wilderness, Jesus is tested throughout the gospel, ultimately by the very forces of evil. And of course, in the resurrection, those are the forces that he defeats. So there's this wider sort of cosmic battle within which the more proximate battles against Jesus' immediate enemies, the Pharisees, scribes, and chief priests, and ultimately even Rome, who crucifies him. All of those are sort of proxies for this wider battle. And perhaps this is related to the wider theological claims that Rome itself would be making, whether under Augustus early on or under the Flavians at this point when the gospel is written, that Rome is itself the conduit of the benefits of the gods. Of course, the perspective of Mark's gospel is that Jesus is that conduit. Now, under persecution and in these difficult circumstances, we can imagine that there is some tension within the Christian community. We certainly see this earlier in Paul's letters, and perhaps even in the Gospels. There are hints of turmoil even among the Christian community in the Gospels. Perhaps with the persecution that we know went on in the middle of the 1st century in Rome, Perhaps pressure under persecution led to people to falter, followers of Jesus, to falter in their faith. And there seem to have also been some internal tensions over leadership. As I mentioned in Paul's letters, we hear he himself was somewhat opposed to Peter and to Jesus' brother James, who exercised leadership in the city of Jerusalem after Jesus' death. So we know that those things were going on. Within the gospel itself, we see this in the repeated failures of the disciples to understand what was going on. They don't understand Jesus' parables. They don't understand about the meaning of the multiplication of the loaves. Judas betrays Jesus. Peter denies him. All of the disciples flee except for the women. But of course, women would have less at stake. They would be less targeted by the Roman authorities. So there are none of his male followers at the foot of the cross. And even when the women go to the tomb and hear that Jesus is risen, that he's in Galilee waiting, or will be in Galilee for his disciples, that they should go and tell this message, they fail too. They're too afraid to say anything to anyone. So this repeated motif of the disciples' failure may have something to do with the challenges of faith under persecution that we see or can imagine in the first century. And then there's this motif that's uniquely emphasized in the Gospel of Mark, which is that whenever Jesus does something like heals someone, like raises Jairus' daughter, or heals the leper, he tells people not to tell anyone that he's just done this. When he's transfigured before his disciples, he tells them, don't say anything to anyone until after I've died and risen. And so there's a lot of discussion about this secrecy motif, this hiding of the message, but it seems to be tied to the idea that Jesus' significance, is even how he is a Messiah, can't be understood except through the death and resurrection. There is also, we know by this point that Mark's gospel is written, the fact that the message of Jesus has spread and been accepted not only by Jews, but also by Gentiles. And so we see a nod to this already in the gospels, even though it's clear Jesus only really worked in the land of Israel among the Jews. There are even here overtures to Gentiles in the gospels. For example, just a few that come to mind, Jesus heals the Gadarene demoniac. He's in the Decapolis, which is the 10 cities that are Greek. That's not Jewish territory. The fact that he expels the legion of demons into swine, signifies we're in non-Jewish territory because swine wouldn't have been eaten by Jews. There is the healing of the centurion's slave. There is the healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Both of those are foreigners, and Jesus still heals them. And finally, the only human in the gospel to recognize that Jesus might be God's son is the centurion, the Roman, at the foot of the cross at the moment Jesus dies, and the curtain in the temple is torn in two and darkness covers the earth. He reads these as omens that Jesus might be a son of God. Now, a couple of other things that are emphasized in this gospel. There are 3 key titles for Jesus. One is Messiah. Clearly, this is what Peter will say at the midpoint of the gospel. This is a term that had many meanings in Judaism at the time the gospel was written. It could mean a royal figure, like the heir of David, but it also could mean a priest. It could mean a suffering servant, as Mark seems to interpret it. It could mean kind of the Son of God coming on the clouds, or the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, the vision of a sort of messianic figure in the book of Daniel in the Jewish scriptures. These terms, Son of God and Son of Man, are also used heavily or frequently at key moments in the Gospel of Mark. Son of God will be perhaps a later title given at the first verse, but Son of God will also be implied by the divine voice at 2 important moments in the Gospel. And the centurion will say, surely, truly, this man was God's son at the end of the Gospel. Though the term that Jesus seems to prefer of himself is not Son of God. The one he uses for himself is Son of Man. The most important motif that Mark emphasizes is that Jesus is a suffering Messiah. The emphasis here is not on his power and glory as a royal Messiah or a victorious Messiah, but it's the suffering and death. It's only then that what Messiah means becomes clear for Mark. As we've seen, this is an earthly contest between individual characters in the gospel, but also a cosmic contest between Jesus, the force of God, the conduit of God's grace in the world, and Hosatan, the force of evil, the personification of evil. This contest is constantly being mounted in the gospel and resolved in favor of God through signs of power. We might call these miracles, or also either healings or nature miracles or victories over demons. But also in Jesus' willingness to do his Father's will, even at the end when this means death. He endures this, and this is a contest that's resolved in God's favor. And of course, ultimately, the resurrection, when Jesus is victorious over death itself, and the force of evil is finally conquered ultimately and most significantly.